Now, as I said, don't have time to go through all 11,000 years of what they've been doing. I have to leave that to your own research. But I can draw one picture for you about a specific time that happened in England in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, but specifically the 17th century, at the time of the Tudor dynasty. A big agenda, an important thing we need to know about concerning this matter took place. And it has to do with this character on the right, who's known as Sir John Dee, and he worked for the British government. And interestingly enough, he was also ambassador to the court of King James, and he would go as an ambassador to Queen Elizabeth I. He would go to different countries. And when he wrote back to her, at the bottom of any intelligence documents he gave, he wrote his signature 007. Because John Dee is the head of MI5. British Secret Service comes from the Tudor dynasty of the 15th century. Ian Flemming, who wrote James Bond, was a member of the Secret Service, and when he retired he thought, I want to write some books, why don't I write about my own organization? So he did, and what you're reading there, and more importantly the movies. Those James Bond movies, if you know how to watch those, they're telling you amazing stories. I mean, obviously you've got to wade through all the phallocratic, macho nonsense, but if you can manage to sit through that stuff, you're going to see something fascinating in those stories. I love them. Notice MI5's logo. Look at that pyramid and the eye at the top. See that? Well, John Dee was a great occultist, sacred geometrist, and court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, and black magician. And he worked for this woman, who is called Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII. The original, who must be obeyed. But her name in history is interesting, I would say. Right? She was known as the Virgin Queen, and it's not because she couldn't get a man. This is about something else. They've, told us lies in history, but Virgin Queen, remember how the offspring of one of the sides would procreate? Think about it. And John Dee was a Rosicrucian, which is a secret society of Freemasons operating in the world. And that is why in all government buildings, as Jordan Maxwell and people have pointed out, you have the Rose Garden and the symbol of the rose. In every capital city of the world, you have the Rose Garden, and the Bohemian Society and all these groups use the symbol of the rose, the Tudor rose. So John Dee was the man around the time when they actually discovered that there's a barrier up there, because by that time they had telescopes, and they maybe had some primitive flying ships. I mean, we've heard about the flying ships for thousands of years, right, and the stuff I've told you about already. But they may have made some primitive crafts and tried to leave the planet and couldn't do it. So it was around about that time, the 13th, 14th, 15th century, that these technocrats realized, hey, we got a serious problem here. We've just spent almost 11,000 years trying to build up the hardware to get out of this planet, and now, no matter what we build, we can't get out because there's a blinking Stargate up there. So they were in turmoil, and that is one of the reasons why those periods of history are so important, not for the reasons they've been telling you in history school. They really were in a dilemma. They were imprisoned in this planet. Remember in the book of Revelation it says, and God will chain the beast to the pit for 1,000 years? Right? Satan being chained to a pit. They realized they couldn't get out. So John Dee, to cut a long story short, said, well, we need another approach. We'll not stop with the development of the hardware, keep that going, but we're going to need an altogether different approach. And he contacted his patrons, the Queen of England and her coterie, these original Illuminati types, and he said, what we need to do is go to a completely higher form of intelligence. Not extraterrestrial, but pan-dimensional. They may be able to help us with this. This is not the first time that such a portal has been opened on our Earth, and it wasn't the last. John Dee contacted some beings that C.S. Lewis refers to as the Macrobes. He says that under our level of perception, we have the microbes. A couple of hundred years ago, if you had talked to anybody about microbes, microbial life, bacteria, they'd have laughed at you. They'd have thought you were insane and probably locked you up if you described that. Then we invented the telescope, and now it's common knowledge, right? A whole universe of life forms, right? Beneath our perception of vision. Well, C.S. Lewis says there is another level above us, on the next level up almost, which is the same. You can't have a physical instrument so much to deal with it. The instrument of noticing that and knowing that is the human intuition. Or shall we say the human imagination. But John Dee, being an occultist and a magician of very great power, opened a portal in England in the 14th century. The 15th century was opened in England. And he contacted beings of a higher grade of intelligence. This thing is a whole study in itself, to do with occultism and what have you. And he contacted these Macrobes, and these Macrobes actually don't like being pestered by inferior types like him. And we can't say they're good or they're bad, you know, that those terms ain't going to work with this. But the long story short, as his mind is nearly frazzling with their interaction, they actually did tell him, oh yeah, what's your problem? And they said, oh yeah, we have no problem with that, we can help you with that, we can, you know, fix that. And he goes, well then, let's do it. But the only trouble was that in order to do it, the information that they had to pour through his consciousness, he very quickly realized would take literally thousands of years to manifest in physical time. When the information started transmitting through his work, and his work was called Enochian magic, for those who happen to be into that, you know when you see all those lovely pictures and quaint images of magicians in circles and all these symbols around and the five-pointed pentagram and all that stuff, have you ever noticed how many of those symbols are actually planetary symbols for the start? I mean, we're talking occultism, yet they're mostly symbols of the planets. Because that also is some subject that's been put before us totally erroneously. I go into that in the book, about what that really is all about and why planetary symbols are used so often. So when he started translating into his Enochian, those quaint things you see in museums, all that information that was pouring down, it was too big for his consciousness and Edward Kelly and some other people that he worked with. So he had to get all his counterparts in Europe to get on the ball with this. So all these Illuminati families and black nobility intelligence people, you know, they were all working simultaneously at the same time. But then obviously history would notice this, wouldn't it? That all of these families start getting into what looks like the occult. So they sold that back to us as a period in history when suddenly there was a renaissance of esoteric knowledge in the world and everybody was into it. As if it's sort of something like a vogue thing, you know? And I'm not saying things like that don't happen. But all over the planet, all these rich families and rich people start getting into the occult. They've got to put it before us in this quaint way, just like they put swashbuckling movies of Errol Flynn in front of you, you know, to tell you something. The real story behind that is that these scholars were all working independently on this vast amount of knowledge which was pouring in day and night through the consciousness of the psychics of the world who worked for these royal families. Cornelius Agrippa and all of these other people were doing it, writing it down. And then later on it was discovered that it's so much information, what they're telling us, and it's also very hard to practicalize, and also they don't even know what it is, because it was a very advanced science, way, way beyond what this guy could translate. So he had to hand all of these dossiers out. And then later it was realized that having each of these intellectual geniuses working in their own little garrets up in the Bavarian hills is not good enough. We're going to have to, this knowledge is getting so much now, you have to bring it together into places where the scholars can come. We call those places universities, universe cities, cities of the universe, or colleges, where you collage information. You see, it wasn't good enough to have everybody doing their own research. The knowledge was getting so immense, they brought it into central places. It's not for you, me, and Grandma to go and get educated and get a degree. They don't care about us. They never did. Now you can do it. They've offered us the privilege, thank God. But my father and your forefathers didn't even know that. Just 50 years ago, didn't even have the privilege of education. So, you know, think about that. We have the privilege. We get a little bit, you know, arrogant about it, yeah. Very, very short time ago in your own families, that was not what was happening. Your fathers were sweating on the fields, wondering what life is all about and why they are going through the lives that they have been going through. We owe it to them. If you're not a humanitarian, that's perfectly all right. If you don't care about humanity, that doesn't bother me. But you have your own family line then, your own tradition, your own private lineage of your forefathers, your mothers and your fathers, your grandfathers who slaved on this planet under these people. You owe it to them to find out the answers and do something. You should be doing it for humanity. But even if that one doesn't, you know, trigger you, I'm assuming it does, everyone who's in this particular venue. But even if it wouldn't, I tell people all the time, if it doesn't hit you on that level, I could get plenty of other reasons why you should do this and fight this fight. The thing is that this knowledge was pouring in thick and fast, so they eventually created the universities. And if you don't believe this, just study the architecture of the universities of the world. Go there and look at the symbols they use in those places, and how they're divided and sequestered, and the robes and the clothes that the scholars wear and everything. And you'll find it's occult. Part of the information that was transmitted to these people from the Macrobes was that in order to even begin to build what you need, you're going to have to basically use the entire planet's mineral resources to get the very physical wealth, you know, to pay the people, to do whatever. It's like running a business, right? Anybody here is a business owner, they know what I'm talking about. Well, this is a business that incorporated building super technologies. So is it not from the 14th and 15th century that we have the rise of the British Empire? This tiny little country that stretches its tentacles out to the rest of the world? Isn't it from that time that we have the universities of the world rising? Isn't it from that time we have the stock exchange rising? Isn't it that time we have the industrial revolution's beginnings? The agricultural revolution, right? Think of just how many things that we now take for granted that came out of that particular time. Wasn't that the time of the new science of Francis Bacon and Newton and Copernicus and Kepler? All looks very divided, doesn't it? Well, because it's divided, because we're learning it from the universities who have been put together by them in the first place, who know how to disseminate the knowledge so that you won't see the overall pattern. But the few at the top of the pyramid know what is really going on. These things don't just arise by themselves. Just study those periods themselves, please. If you go even on a trip to England, on a holiday, and you go through those lovely estates, those beautiful estates of the landed gentry, just ask, when is the architecture? Ask the guides, when do these get built? 90% of the stately homes in England were all built around the 16th century. Something happened in that time of England that we now inherit, which we have as modern times. Before that, the kings were shivering in their castles. They didn't even have glass for the windows. And yet suddenly something happens. So the British Empire arose, and they sent out the pirates. They sent out their emissaries from the Hudson Bay Company and the East India Company to the four corners of the world to enslave the world, to get the mineral resources, to get the slavery, to get the gold, to bring it back for one agenda orchestrated by just a very few people of the Tudor dynasty. America's destiny is very much involved in this. Through the Hudson Bay Company and the Russell Trust, this country was also taken over by the pirates. Pirates, the word pirates is from pyrate, fire. The fire ones, the Illuminati, the ones who have the fire. Right? We've been watching too much Errol Flynn, and they put before us all this romantic stuff. Find out who these characters were and what they were up to. Just study the pirates alone. Just study the main pirates and their biographies, those characters. It's a fascinating story will unfold that you won't be able to explain unless you have these answers. Some of these pirate leaders had tremendous magical powers. They were also extremely brutal and ruthless. Now, the Macrobes, they don't do nothing for free. First of all, they told John Dee and his cohorts that to get the key to the Stargate, you need to do two things. The first thing you need to do has to be in two parts. The first thing you need to do is to find out how to make matter from energy. I'm cutting a long story short. It took them hundreds of years just to read through this stuff. But they said, you're too stupid to even know how to do that. So we have to teach you the opposite first, which is how to release energy from matter. That's not what you're going to do, but that's how you have to learn. And to do that, it's going to take you 500 years. Remember when Oppenheimer split the bomb? Split the atom? That was when they patted themselves on the back, because phase one was accomplished. The pupils had learned now how to release energy from matter that day. Remember, even people said, my God, they could have destroyed this whole arm of the universe. Well, they don't care, because they have to prove to their masters now, right, that they've learned phase one. That's actually not what they have to learn. They have to learn the opposite. That they had to learn phase one of how to release energy from matter. That was done. Now they're doing the opposite. Now, slowly, they're beginning to learn how to create matter from energy, which is what the Macrobes told them is one of the keys to get out of the Stargate. MIT, SRI, NEC Corporation, and also Sun Corporation are just fronts for that. That's all they are. They're just fronts for that particular agenda. The second key involved, the Macrobes told them, involves the element known as silicon. You're talking to John Dee in the 14th century. You don't know what anything is this. What? Right? So they're telling them this stuff, and they said the second key has to do with silicon. What we're calling the silicon revolution is the end game that is now being played out, which is why you see these symbols coming from the ancient world, on these logos. But the Macrobes don't do anything for nothing. So John Dee goes, well, what do you want in return for your knowledge? And they said, we want blood. Because just like any entity, any vampire, right? Blood is energy. And if you study the occult, you'll realize that blood is a form of energy. And blood happens to be the second most commonest word in the Bible after God. So John Dee goes, oh, how much do you want and when do you want it? No worries. Oh yeah, tell when and where. So the Macrobes said, well, We want sacrifices. Ladies and gentlemen, is it not also since that time of the 16th century that the wars, not battles between two maniac kings with a couple of hundred knights, but I'm talking about the wars, begin? Not only the ships and the trade routes and the debauchery, Africa, what these people have done to just that continent alone? We don't have to go there. Think about what they've done in America. But isn't it also that time that the great wars begin? Have you ever questioned why it is that all the soldiers always wear occult symbols? Because in order to have a ritual death, even if you just study your common garden black magician who's going to kill a cat, right? They have to draw the right circle, do it under the right constellations, do it under the right timing, right? Think of a mass on a huge level that has to send up energy to these beings. It can't be done, it doesn't qualify as a ritual killing unless certain things are done properly. So the location is very important, and the timing is also very important. So they said the ritual centers, our cities are actually, that's what they are, they're ritual centers for that. Do you know that there's 23 zodiacs in Washington, D.C., sequestered into the architecture there? That's more than any single place on the planet. In this book that was recently done, The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital, this author goes into that, into the memoirs of the Library of Congress of all the founding fathers to describe. He doesn't know what he's looking at, but at least he presents the information of why these centers exist. So when you see our cities, these ritual cities, please realize that the geometry that's been proven now to be involved in them, through that book and previously through the work of George Maxwell and others, that these cities are designed specifically for reasons. And those monuments and obelisks that you see, they're all for reasons. To enhance grid energy, to be sacrificial sites. Lady Diana Spencer was killed not far from this Eiffel Tower, right? At the junction of 3 roads, at the 13th pillar, etc., etc., etc. 100 years, almost to the day when Jack the Ripper killed his first victim on the 31st of August. A virgin. Right? Lady Diana Spencer represents the virgin, right? In occult terms. The whores that Jack the Ripper killed represent in esoteric terms a willing victim or a sacrificial victim. The 31st of January is when the sign of the Virgin, the Virgo constellation, goes into the underworld. On that day. The Virgin constellation of Virgo descends into the underworld. They take out the Virgin then. I teach this extensively, all of these rituals and what they get up to. They're not going to use solar astrology, because then the average astrologer would get onto this. They use other kinds of astrology that are more esoteric. I specialize in that and go into this whole ball game about how geometry and sacred geometry is used in the designs of cities, and how assassinations of John F. Kennedy and other groups, other people, are entirely based on this. It's something we're living in them, we might as well know about it. It's happening in our backyard, and how this American designs of cities are like a silicon chip. Now remember we talked about the ancient monuments, what they were built for? When these people went, when the serpent race went to different parts of the world, they had long lifespans, these sons of the serpent, but when they would actually die, their fellows, who remained, in order to commemorate the amazing life of this person, who's part alien, who had come from another star system, who had enlightened the world, who brought civilization, healing, they could mend bones, they enlightened the Adamic race, who gave them freedom, who literally were our gods. When one of these people would die, they would erect, not over them, not as tombs, but they would build in sacred geometry with using harmonics, a edifice as a cenotaph, not a tomb, a cenotaph, there's a difference, right? To commemorate the fall of that being. And that's what those tombs are, and what happens when you're there. Right? When you go to those places and feel something, you're connecting with something. Remember all those ritual murders and deaths that happened in the Aztecs and the Druids, how suddenly all these wonderful cultures went to wreck and ruin and went into sacrifice and death and bloodshed? That was to change this when the other side came back in power again. But just know for now that these serpent people had a habit of doing that, and they would try to make the harmonics and the sacred geometry embody some aspect of that particular hero that died, some particular beloved, means that this person communicated. They try to do it in stone to make that person live. Today that's what we do when we raise a gravestone to a dead loved one. We don't realize we're doing that now, but that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to encompass something of that person's life. Now the dark aliens do it too. When one of their beings died, they would bury this person and they would build something over it. And in fact, when one of them characters would die, wherever their bones were buried, that has become historically a place of unbelievable unrest in the world. And when I looked into this occult paradigm, I found out that two places where two of these dark masters are buried, one is Palestine and the other is Northern Ireland. So I've been working on, at some point getting some sort of exorcism done where we can remove these remains. It's not going to be easy because they're protected and the Dark Ones know where they are and worship those places and altar. But yeah, the aura of the negativity that comes from these people's bodies, it causes conflict, which they suck off and suck off and suck off. Now, interesting too, because the White Brotherhood, where they're buried, is always feelings of great peace and protection, So when you remember, you're talking about earth changes, some people are fanatical about earth changes and where to go, if there's going to be earth changes. I personally don't buy into that, and I'm not of that disposition, but I have respect for those who do. Well, one of the things is these monuments, their very positioning is of interest because they have protection around them.